Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on transportation for students experiencing homelessness. This is part 3 of our 4-part back to school series. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're returning, thank you and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking again about all things transportation. And we have, my name is Ana Sofia Treyes. I'm a K-12 Senior Program Manager here at Schoolhouse Connection. In a moment, you'll hear from my colleague, Karen Rice. And we have some lovely panelists from their LEAs who are going to share a little bit about what they're doing in their districts to support transportation. So packed agenda today. But before we get started, want to cover a quick housekeeping slide. So this webinar should last an hour. We tend to get a ton of questions in these webinars, and we love to hear from you. So please share them, but we just ask that you share them in the Q&A panel on your control panel in Zoom. Usually there's a lot of chat activity. I can already see people introducing themselves, which is lovely. We want that, but we don't want your questions to get lost. So please put them in the Q&A if possible. This session is being recorded and it'll be posted on our website in the coming days, and you will be issued a certificate of attendance for participating in today's webinar. If you have not already, we encourage you to join our Schoolhouse Connection on Slack. This is a really, really great community of McKinney-Vento liaisons and other folks in the field across the country. So if you're tired of hearing from us and you want to hear some input from other folks, this is a great place to pose your questions. So I encourage you to do that as well. And in the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about Schoolhouse Connection for folks who may not be familiar with us. We are a national organization that works to overcome homelessness from prenatal to post-secondary, and we do that by partnering with a variety of folks in the field by providing strategic advocacy and practical assistance. Our website is full of resources, including implementation tools for folks, McKinney-Vento liaisons and others who may be implementing the law in their districts. We have a lot of information about our state and federal policy advocacy. And of course, we have our youth scholarship program, where we not only support our young scholars with financial assistance, but also case management support. That application is going to be opening back up in January. And the best way to stay in touch with all things Schoolhouse Connection is to join our newsletter. So I encourage you to do that as well to stay up to date on all things Schoolhouse Connection. In this slide, I want to talk a little bit about just some learning objectives for today, just so everyone has a sense of where we're going. So I'm hoping that everyone will walk away today understanding the McKinney-Vento Act and the requirements for providing transportation for students experiencing homelessness. We're also hoping that you will learn a little bit about some local and regional liaisons are addressing transportation across various geographic locations. And then we're also hoping to share just some strategies to help you implement some of these requirements in your LEAs. Also wanted to talk a little bit about an agenda. Like I mentioned, we're going through a lot of different things in this webinar, so wanted to talk a little bit about, again, where we're headed. So we're going to start by talking about data, and we'll talk about some transportation requirements. Karen has taken it upon herself to talk all of the McKinney-Vento requirements, and so we'll hear from her then. And then we're going to hear some strategies and best practices. So hear directly from McKinney-Vento liaisons who are implementing this in their districts. We'll go through just talking a little bit about some examples in the field. We will answer questions. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can, but we know that there's a lot of you and only a few of us, so we'll do our best. And of course, we'll share any resources related to transportation. And I'm going to just go ahead and kick us off talking about around data. So what you're looking at here is data that comes directly from our Schoolhouse Connection data profile. So if this is not your first back to school webinar, you've probably heard us talk about this at length, but want to just remind folks again that we have a data profile that sources data from the U.S. Department of Education, and the most recent available data is from school year 22-23. And so you'll see that nationally in that school year, 1.37 million pre-K to 12 children and youth were identified as experiencing homelessness. Another thing that's really important about this piece of data is that of those students, the majority of them were temporarily staying with others due to an economic hardship, loss of housing, or a similar reason, or what we commonly refer to as doubled up. For our students who are doubled up in particular, they can experience all different kinds of housing moves throughout the year. They may be staying with somebody who can only house them for a night or a week or a month on end. And so for those students in particular, they may be experiencing various housing moves. And of course, depending on the circumstances, that transportation will need to be catered to those housing moves. And so want to keep that in mind as you're thinking about kind of what's happening in your district and what those transportation needs could look like depending on where you are. And then you've, again, probably heard us say this a bunch already, but want to remind folks that often when we talk about student homelessness, we like to provide some data that talks specifically about the impacts of homelessness on academic achievement and attainment. So we know that for our students experiencing homelessness, they are overrepresented among students experiencing chronic absenteeism nationally. So in school year 22-23, they experienced chronic absenteeism at rates that were much higher than their permanently housed peers. And that is significant because we know that for students who are chronically absent, they are more likely to drop out of school and they are less likely to reach graduation, which, as you can see by the graphic on the right here, is already significantly lower for our students experiencing homelessness, even lower than those students who are economically disadvantaged. So really, again, we hear often that transportation is a really big barrier for regular attendance. And so what feels like setting up a very complicated transportation route or a bus or a van or any of that really does have some real impact on some of these data pieces here. And I started to kind of talk about this a little bit, but want to remind everyone again, that transportation really, really is one of the most common barriers that we hear that for our students experiencing homelessness that prevents them from showing up to school regularly. Again, as we've talked a little bit, there's a really important correlation between chronic absenteeism and high school graduation rates. And we know that for our children and youth experiencing homelessness, just getting that high school diploma can be a huge, huge change in their life and really can be the way to break the cycle of poverty and homelessness. So again, thank you all for doing the work that you do and keeping our students front of mind, because this is really, really kind of changing lives here. So I want to remind everyone about that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Karen.
All right, well, we are going to jump in and talk about some transportation requirements under McKinney-Vento. I did just drop, again, the link to the slides in the chat. And the reason that I'm telling you that right now is because we are not going to read all of this legal language for you on these slides. But I know that sometimes it's really important for you all as liaisons to have the exact citation from the law when you're advocating for students and you're working with others in your LEA, to have where it says in the law what the requirement is. I know that's helpful. So wanted you to have access to those through the link that's in the chat. So those are our slides for today. I also want to preface before we start talking about the requirements that we know that transportation is one of the most difficult pieces of McKinney-Vento that LEAs are facing right now. We unfortunately cannot solve everyone's transportation crisis today. We know that there are so many different things happening between bus driver shortages and lack of vehicles and school buses and things. We really do know and understand that this is a very difficult topic. And so bear with us. We hope that some of the strategies that we share, and we hope that our panel of amazing liaisons will also have some things that will be helpful moving forward. But just wanted to kind of preface that to say that we know that this is a really big challenge that many LEAs are facing. So let's jump in and talk about the requirements of McKinney-Vento. So what's required, first and foremost, we need to make sure that our families or our unaccompanied youth who are experiencing homelessness are informed of their right to transportation to and from the school of origin. And so they need to know that they have that right so that they can request transportation and make sure that they have access to it. And often for our unaccompanied youth, they may not understand the importance of transportation, or they may not understand kind of how to go about getting that arranged. And so it's particularly important for our unaccompanied youth that as liaisons, you are really advocating and making sure that your youth know and understand what right they do have to transportation and removing that barrier. On the next slide, I want to just talk about for other transportation, and this is not school of origin transportation. LEAs are required to provide transportation that's comparable to that transportation that's provided to house students. So often when I say that, I get a lot of questions. If you have questions about what exactly that means, hang on to those because we're going to unpack that a little bit. I just wanted to kind of start by putting that out there, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. In particular, those of you who have questions about walk zones and how to navigate that, we are going to spend a whole slide talking about some strategies to use with that comparable transportation. I do want to also say that LEAs must eliminate the lack of transportation as a barrier. And this is really important because, as Anna Sophia mentioned, with chronic absenteeism data, transportation is a huge barrier for students getting to school that affects their attendance. Our students, if they can't get there, they can't attend, they can't engage, they can't participate and do all of those things. And so this transportation piece really is important to make sure that we can first get our students in school to be serving and supporting them under McKinney-Vento. We're also going to talk a lot about this next point. So if you have additional questions about this next point, hang on to those. Hopefully I'll address all of your questions. But one important piece about McKinney-Vento is that if transportation to and from the school of origin crosses district lines or crosses those LEA boundaries, the two districts must agree on what that transportation is going to look like or share the cost equally. So LEAs can come up with a different plan that works for them or have that shared fiscal responsibility. This also is true for transportation across state lines. But again, if you have questions, hang on to that. We're going to get into that a little bit more in just a couple of slides. A couple more just requirements that I wanted to talk about also is thinking particularly about the mode of transportation. And the mode of transportation, the law says, cannot present a barrier to attendance. And I know this is a particularly challenging one where there are not a lot of options for transportation. When I was a liaison, we had the very distinct pleasure of owning all of our school buses. And so I could get 99% of my McKinney-Vento students on school buses, and that made the most sense for us in our LEA. I also know, and I've been around long enough to know that that's an exception and not a rule when it comes to LEA transportation. And so really want to challenge you to think about what that mode of transportation looks like. And if you're seeing attendance issues and you're seeing that your students are having a hard time getting to school, to think about maybe changing that mode of transportation and really looking at that as a possible barrier to that attendance. And then finally, I want to just mention this one, and again, we'll come back to this with some strategies in just a minute, but thinking about transportation for extracurricular activities. So the law requires that students are enrolled and attending and participating fully in school, and that includes those extracurricular activities. If you've been around students long enough, you know that those extracurricular activities are what keep students engaged and coming to school. And those are so, so meaningful for our students. And so it's critical to make sure that our students experiencing homelessness have access to those activities and have that barrier removed so that transportation is not what's preventing them from participating. All right, so I want to talk for a minute about school of origin transportation. So I said we'd jump into this a little bit more. This is where we're going to do that. So when we're thinking about school of origin transportation, it's really important that we're considering what's in the best interest of the student when we're talking about transportation. Now, McKinney-Vento presumes that remaining in the school of origin is in the student's best interest, but sometimes it may not be. And so we could spend another hour talking about best interest determinations and what that looks like. But a couple of factors that you can take into consideration when you're really thinking about that best interest piece is graduation requirements or progress toward graduation. If a student is on track toward graduation and attending another school is not in that student's best interest because they won't be on track toward graduation, then that absolutely makes that case to remain in the school of origin with that transportation provided. We can always take a look at age of the student. A longer commute for a younger student might be more difficult. It might present some behavior challenges or some other things as a result of having that long ride to school. Whereas for an older student, that may not be the same kind of factor. And so things like that are really what we want to take into consideration when it comes to those longer rides for transportation. But it's important to note that McKinney-Vento doesn't set any parameters around mileage or time limit for transportation. So if you have in your LEA where somebody says, you know, we only transport for 10 miles outside of our LEA, I will encourage you and strongly recommend that you really look at that policy, because McKinney-Vento does not say that there's any kind of distance limitations. We're always looking at the best interest of that student. Again, I want to talk about that kind of shared transportation piece. And this has been something that's come up a lot lately. We've heard from a number of liaisons and states around the country really thinking about how do we navigate some of these challenges with that shared transportation cost. So the law is very clear that if a transportation situation crosses LEA lines, both LEAs have to be a part of determining how that transportation is provided, or if they can't agree on another option, to share that cost equally. And so what I want to say to you as my strongest recommendation when it comes to this is be in communication with the liaison that you are sharing that transportation with. So if you know there's a student in your LEA who is currently staying in another LEA, reach out to that liaison. When I was a state coordinator, I heard all the time that, well, we just got a bill. We didn't even know we had a shared student, or we had another transportation option that we could have provided that would have gotten the student to school in a shorter amount of time, but we didn't know that we had a shared student. And so I really want to encourage you to reach out to that liaison in that sharing district, in that LEA, whether it's within your own state or even if that crosses state lines for those of you that have your LEA along those state lines. Because if you're just sending a bill, there may be other options that that other LEA is able to really consider and provide. There's also some creative options that you could look at with that other LEA. And so really thinking about building those partnerships and those connections to really look at what's most efficient and effective for the student and for your LEA. All right, again, I want to say that the mode of transportation is at the discretion of the LEA as long as it doesn't create barriers. And so when I mentioned that the LEA that I was a liaison in, we owned our own buses, we were able to get so many of our students onto our school buses. But we did certainly have situations where a school bus didn't work. We had families who were moving around quite a bit where we couldn't get bus routes set up fast enough. And so instead of saying we have all of our students on school buses and that's just our mode of transportation, for those students, we had to get more creative. We had to use cabs, we had to use ride services, we had to do some other things. And so think about those situations where there may be extenuating circumstances or there may be other needs for transportation. Knowing that as the LEA, you can determine that mode of transportation, just make sure that that's not a barrier. I also want to talk about the idea of stigmatizing students based on transportation. And I always share this story when I talk about transportation, but when I was a liaison, again, we had most of our students on school buses. However, we did have one student who was transported through a cab to school. And that was what worked best for that student's family. They were highly mobile. One day that student was dropped off at school and a teacher who was also in that building pulled up to school in a cab. She had dropped her car off at a mechanic for the day. And that student went over to her and said, "Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, I didn't know you were homeless too. It's only those of us who are homeless that come to school in cabs." And that was a huge wake-up call for me, that we need to think about making sure that we're not stigmatizing our students, that it's not commonly known that our students experiencing homelessness are the only ones who are arriving to school this way. And so I want to just offer that as a suggestion to think about when you're thinking about your options for transportation and how to do that, making sure that we're not stigmatizing our students. There also are funding sources, because when it comes to transportation, the most commonly asked question is, how do we pay for this? And so I just want to offer some ideas for funding sources to offset some of the transportation costs that exist. So your Title I Part A homeless set-aside funds can cover the cost of transportation, the excess cost of transportation. Some of you may receive education for homeless children and youth subgrants through your state agency. That can also cover transportation costs. State and local funds are also a way to do that, and I know many of you use those funding sources. And then community partnerships. And I want to just encourage you to think about who in your community could you work with to provide some different transportation options. When we get to our strategies and our best practices, I'll share a couple of examples of how those partnerships could look. All right, and so I want to just mention comparable transportation. And again, we'll talk more about some of the strategies behind this. And so if we have students who are attending and that student is on they're staying in a place that's on a normal bus route, Or there is a policy in the LEA that students kind of in that area that are staying in that area take public transportation to school. Those are typically the methods that we use. So again, thinking about that comparable transportation. Or if a student is in a walk zone and they're staying somewhere that's in that walk zone, it's fine for that student to walk to school as long as there are no barriers to attendance. So sometimes there may be issues that we don't know about at first that may be causing barriers because that student doesn't have transportation or has a different transportation option. I know that when I was working with students, I had a student who was in our walk zone, and we provided a bus door to door for that student because of a pretty significant domestic violence situation where we would not have typically provided that to our students. But we were thinking about the student's safety and things like that. So there may be exceptions that come up when you're looking at some of this comparable transportation. And again, in just a minute, I'm going to share some strategies kind of how to navigate some of those. All right, extracurricular activities. So we talked about this and how LEAs must eliminate barriers to participate in these activities. So we want to make sure that our students have access to all of those different activities that keep them engaged, keep them coming to school, keep them participating, and making sure that if transportation is a barrier, that it's provided. And I will say that when we talk about extracurricular activities, the number one thing I hear is we don't have bus drivers to send school buses at the end of a practice or at the end of an activity. And so I'm going to encourage you to get creative when you're thinking about transportation for these extracurricular activities. It does not have to be a school bus. There are other options. There are other ways to navigate that. I'll share some strategies with you in just a minute, but to really think outside the box and how to meet some of these transportation needs at times that are not typically within the regular school day. And then I also wanted to just mention preschool transportation for our youngest learners. We know that preschool is included in the definition of school of origin under McKinney-Vento. And so again, if transportation is a barrier, the LEA must provide transportation to that LEA administered preschool program. So that could include an LEA 4K, Head Start, if there are IDEA, special education services, things like that. And so one resource that's on this slide that hopefully you'll take a quick peek at is thinking about, is my early childhood program a McKinney-Vento preschool? And that's a great place to start when you're thinking about, I'm not quite sure if this meets that definition that I need to provide transportation. I want to encourage you to take a look at this resource, and that will kind of give you some additional guidance on what that transportation might look like for that young child. All right, the part you've been waiting for, offering you some strategies and best practices around really how to make this transportation piece work. So let's jump in and talk about just a couple of kind of high level strategies for you. So first and foremost, arranging transportation prior to the first day of school is really, really important when we're thinking about our students who are getting to school, who are having access to some of those first day of school activities. You know, it's those first couple days of school where kids are learning routines and they're meeting their teachers and they're getting to know the other kids in their class. And we want our students experiencing homelessness to have access to all of that as well. And so if you don't have transportation services arranged before that first day of school, it's possible that your students may be missing some of those critical pieces to that new school year. So I would encourage you to think about different ways that you can make sure that that transportation begins before and is ready to go for that first day of school. When I was a liaison, I would start 2 weeks before the first day of school, and I would reach out to all of my families that I worked with to identify and re-identify and make sure that transportation was beginning and ready to go for that first day of school, because it's really important for our kiddos to be there. Another kind of high level idea is to think about forming transportation consortia with neighboring districts. Now, this sounds a little bit complicated, but I would encourage you to think about, are there ways that you can all get together and pool your resources? If you have buses that are crossing LEA lines, and that bus, the student isn't staying in your LEA, but that bus is crossing those lines, can you somehow get together and figure out how to utilize those busing systems and really think about what that might look like? And so again, this goes back to collaborate with that liaison, collaborate together, and really work together to come up with what those systems might look like. You could also consider coordinating pickup and drop off at LEA boundaries. So that might look like a student gets on a bus and your LEA goes to that LEA boundary, and the bus from the other LEA meets you at that point, picks the student up, and goes to that student's school. And so that is certainly allowable. I know when I talk about that, I usually get questions from people that say, we're just dropping off our student and hoping the other bus shows up. And that's not what I'm saying, but it's really coordinating that and having that student go from one bus to the other bus to ensure the student's safety, but to also share transportation responsibilities that way. There's also the option to split bus routes or to split transportation routes so that maybe the LEA where the student is staying does pick up in the morning and takes that child to school. And the LEA where the child is in school does afternoon and picks that child up at school and brings them home. And that is certainly one way to manage that shared transportation agreement. I know there are many LEAs who have been able to partner with their public transit system that provides free rides with a student ID. Now, this is great when it comes to thinking about all of those other places that our students might need to go. And so if you have older students who have jobs and you can work out this partnership with your public transit, that might be a way to remove the barrier for that student to get to their job after school or to get to some other place that they need to get to. And then also one other thing I want to offer for you is thinking about those family engagement activities and those after school activities. We know that it's really important to connect families to our schools and to have them to have a sense of community in our school buildings. And so it's really important that we're thinking about how do we provide family transportation for those activities. I know that there are some LEAs that provide buses that go out to communities for family engagement events, and parents and students can get on those buses and come into school. I know some LEAs provide cabs and different rideshare services that go into the community and pick up families to bring them to school. And so just thinking about how you can remove that barrier to help with that piece as well. All right, let's talk specifically about walk zones because this is a question that we get very often. And I just want to offer these as some ideas and some options. And I know sometimes it's not so simple, but our students who are staying in a walk zone, unless there is some kind of extenuating circumstance, they can absolutely walk to school in that walk zone. I know sometimes parents and caregivers have hesitations about that. And so a couple of options that I wanted to offer you here is thinking about the idea of partnering with local faith-based organizations or other nonprofits in the community. And of course, background checking volunteers and making sure that process is done. But those volunteers can then go into neighborhoods and walk with groups of students to school and make sure, and there's an adult making sure that those kids get to school and make sure that kids are safe along the way. But that's one way to kind of navigate that walk zone piece. This particular school district in Colorado, Cherry Creek, that I mentioned here, they have a strong partnership with their College and Career Readiness Center. And so as part of that, they have a group of high school students who refurbishes bikes and then provides them to McKinney-Vento students. I know there are a number of LEAs, particularly with their ARP-HCY funds, that started using bikes for students within the walk zone and had really great success with their attendance rates for that as well. Connecting families and helping build some of that sense of community with families who may be in that similar walk zone and helping set up buddy systems, introducing families and caregivers to each other so that they can say, hey, I could walk our students to school this day, or we could walk together, or we could get to know each other and our families and this kind of sense of community that we're developing in this neighborhood. And certainly think about how you can recruit your families as volunteers. Again, doing all of that background check process to walk with families. I have a friend whose son lives in the walk zone to their school, and they have different parents, different days of the week, do kind of that walking school bus with students in that community to get all of the students in that neighborhood to school. All right, I mentioned that I was going to talk about extracurricular activities, so let me offer you a couple of strategies when it comes to extracurricular activities. It is a great idea to partner with a coach or a club advisor or a teacher or whatever adult is kind of supervising and chaperoning that club or activity. It may be a time to let that person know what the situation is and that you're working with that student to help provide transportation. Of course, we always want to follow FERPA and make sure that we're sharing only with people who need to know, but in this case, with participation in their activity, that may be a need to know situation. And so thinking about, can you provide that coach or that advisor with gas cards to hand out to that student? This particular region that I highlighted on this example, they have a stack of $5 gift cards, and that liaison gives those to the coach. And then if there are other families or other students who can drive that student, then they are given that $5 gas card to take that student home and to kind of arrange some of those carpools. I know a lot of LEAs have concerns with carpools and really helping coordinate that. So absolutely follow your LEA policies and procedures on what that looks like. But that's also a great way to help to build some connections and community across our families and our students. So if there are ways to have conversations with families or with youth about coordinating those carpools and what they might feel comfortable with, that's the best place to start. And then again, thinking about funding sources that may be options. Maybe it's the coach that provides transportation as they're leaving their activity and going home, and the LEA is reimbursing that coach for the cost of transportation. Maybe you do have access to buses that can pick up things like that. Maybe you do have access to rideshare services. Maybe it's a gas card to the parent as they come, or the caregiver as they come to pick that child up. So again, just thinking about kind of those funding sources and what those options might be. And then finally, I want to offer a few strategies for our young learners, our kids in early childhood programs. So a couple of examples that I wanted to share, and I mentioned that I'd talk a little bit about community partnerships, so I'm going to start a little bit here. So just a couple of ideas for you. This particular region in Texas, their early Head Start program partners with a local church to provide transportation. That local church has access to vehicles, and of course, they've done their due diligence with background checks and liability and insurance and things like that, but they're able to use those vehicles to transport some of their young children. The school district in Wisconsin partners with Boys and Girls Clubs to transport their early learners to their district preschool. So the Boys and Girls Clubs have vans, and their volunteers, of course, are all background checked, and they have all of that worked out in an MOU between the Boys and Girls Club and the school district. And they're able to use those vans and those drivers in the community. And what's really actually amazing about this example is that it's helped to connect more families to the Boys and Girls Clubs to access additional resources like after school care and meals and things like that. Also want to say that if you have a college or university in your community, there might be opportunities for partnerships there as well. With Kennesaw State University, they offer their campus shuttle to students experiencing homelessness with young children that need to be transported. I know that the university that I went to had shuttles that we could also, our families that were coming onto campus that had young children attending different programs, we could also use those campus shuttles to transport our young children as well. So think about who those partnerships, where those partnerships might be able to develop, who those community partners are that have vehicles. I heard recently about an LEA who used a van from a local hotel that had a shuttle service, and they weren't often busy during the day. And so they leveraged that partnership, and they created an agreement with the hotel to use that shuttle to transport students. So thinking maybe outside the box of who are those folks in the community that have vehicles and that have access to transportation that you could start to build some partnerships with. So with that, and speaking about partnerships and transportation and strategies, I am very excited to turn it over to Danny Graham from the Eau Claire Area School District. So Danny is going to share with us what they are doing in their LEA, and then following that, we will hear from Ben in Polk County, Florida. And so excited to offer you some options and some ideas from some of your colleagues.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share for a little bit. I'm just going to set my timer for 10 minutes because those who know me know I can talk. So just wanted to get that ready. Sorry. All right. So I wanted to share how we have leveraged some of our Title I money to provide a different kind of transportation in our district, and it's been very successful. So we thought we'd share it out, and hopefully this is something that you guys may be able to use in one way or another. It started with when we got the American Rescue Plan money. We got two waves of it, two chunks of it for the Eau Claire Area School District in Wisconsin. So we took both of those and decided we were going to purchase 2 minivans. We understood, we had been using cabs for a while. We kind of understood how to route the cabs. And so this was taking it one step further by having our own vehicles, which meant we added a layer of drivers that our district, those are the first drivers our district had ever employed, because we contract with our bus company. And then also how to maintain those vehicles, which we already have a fleet in our district, so that wasn't so difficult, but that was extra things to think about. So we had the funding available, and of course it was allowable to spend it on the minivans. Our purchasing person in our district figured out, good cost. We ended up with Chrysler Pacificas, if anybody's wondering, and they were used, but only a couple of years used. So they should, technically, they say they have a life of about 8 years. And that's on the budget side of things. So they're thinking about how do we replace these in 8 years in the business office. So we started with one. It went really well. We saw attendance increase for students, of course, but even more so than our cab rides, because those drivers were handpicked by us. We were interviewing them. We were finding people who, when we explained in the interview process, your job is not only to drive, but to be the best start or end of a student's day. That's what those those applicants were interested in. They wanted to be a part of that student's day and really make a difference. And so that is a lot different than a cab company just hiring drivers who are there to be a taxi cab driver. And then their connection, being a staff member, of course, you're just going to have a closer connection to how they operate within a district. So we started out with the one van. I think we began rides in March of 2024. And then by summer of last year, we knew that we wanted to purchase another van right away. It's great because I know that at our school district bus company, or our local bus company, it's a little bit harder for them to get drivers because they're driving large vehicles. So it's a school bus or it's a suburban. But when you start talking about driving a minivan, it's a lot more conceptual for retired teachers or retired school staff members to drive a minivan. They're comfortable with that. So we started getting word of mouth from drivers to other people that they knew. And now we have a really good base of drivers, to the point where we actually, in our last round of interviewing, we had to tell somebody, we really like them, but we can't hire them at this time because we wouldn't be able to give enough hours for everybody who's involved. So if that tells you something about, how do you get drivers, how do you employ them and keep them, you'll actually find, if they're minivans that they're driving, and you do things right by training them, that you're probably not going to have any issues. We pay their drivers here about $15 an hour, which is pretty average for being a driver. Of course, that might look different depending on where you're from and your cost of living. And again, they're not doing it for the money. I mean, all our drivers say how important those kids are to them. They will see some of the same kids during their routes, and then they'll have switch ups too. So the other piece is the routing. So I do organize all the routing for the vans. I did have to go to my bus company, the local bus company, and they were very kind to show me how they route and how they figure stuff out. It's not that difficult, to be honest. It just takes a little practice of maybe Google Maps and kind of having somebody who can look at, all right, I got to pick so-and-so up here, and they go to this school, and then I got to get this person. They're kind of near that person. And you just Tetris them together. And I am happy. I know that makes it simplifies it, but I'm happy to talk to anybody who would like a little more in depth on that. But really, the routing is not too difficult if you have somebody that can spend some time on that. I would say about an hour a day, which for some of you that's a lot, but it's worth it, because one, the relationships and what that brings to the students that are receiving rides from your own minivans versus a taxi cab are so much different, so much better. And two, the cost savings, which I'll talk about, is so worth it. So we were spending about $40,000 per cab to transport students for a school year. And we were using about 5 cabs a year. When we went to the minivan, now granted, we purchased the minivans with ARP money, but just looking at what the cost is to pay drivers, and then we also built in a certain amount, I think it was 6,000 a year, to put away to purchase another minivan in 8 years. We were still only spending 20,000 a year on a minivan. We were transporting less students in our cabs. We are transporting more students in our minivans, and it just worked out that they're more reliable. You know, we're just able to be more efficient with those minivans. Our cabs, even though we laid out our schedules perfectly, they minivan drivers or cab drivers were still struggling to follow our routes, and so that just delayed our routes a little more. So we're finding it more efficient and half the cost at least. The gas and supplies that we need for year to year, that's built into the budget. Just think of that as the money that you were going to spend on cabs. Again, so that gas, supplies, driver, and even money to buy the next vehicle in the future was only 20,000. So again, very cost effective. So community partners and getting creative. So we actually have a third vehicle, the third minivan we added this year. That was not purchased by ARP money. That was purchased with a partnership with our community foundation. Now, just think of it as any place in your community that might be able to, or a consortium of places that might be able to pull together money and purchase a van for you. It could be a group of churches, group of businesses. You can go to your business association. But the story's easy. When you say, here's the cost savings we're going to have, we don't have it in our budget, but we're looking for somebody who wants to do feel good stuff. It's a way easier ask than you think. It just takes going and talking to a few people until you find that one or two people that are willing to champion that and start looking into it. But helping homeless students get to school is a worthy cause, and people see that very quickly. So we partnered with our community foundation and made that ask, and they helped us purchase the third vehicle. And our district had a commitment, knowing that we were going to save money again on another cab. Our district had a commitment to continue funding that. So, you know, we have things that we have in our vehicles. Our district does provide a cell phone in each of the vehicles that is especially for that vehicle, so that we have communication. The vehicles are parked at our service center, a building that normally they have all the maintenance trucks and such at. And then the drivers will go to the service building, go into the building, get the pouch that has the key and the phone and like the emergency maintenance brochures, anything they need. The gas card is in there for a local gas stations, a number of them that are pretty prevalent in the area. And they grab that, they get in the van, they go. And I create routes and I text them. I do a screenshot and text them pictures so that there's no hassle of trying to print and have it in the minivan. We just, I'm like, hey, this is hot off the press from this morning. So I text them pictures of the routes, and then also text them if anybody has called in to cancel a ride or maybe a change. And it has just been nothing but great compared to the unreliability that we saw with cabs, the people or drivers not knowing how to handle students and behaviors. And I'll just tell you a story. I think that was kind of the last straw, where all of a sudden cab company said, oh, well, we haven't picked anybody up because this driver was just sick of driving and he just stopped picking people up. And it's the early morning, you know, we have no other way of getting these students to school. And that's when we realized we needed to do different for our students. That's what I got.
And I'll turn it over to you.
All right. I am Ben Roosh. I am the liaison for Polk County Public Schools here in Central Florida. Thank you, Karen and Anna Sophia, for all of this really great information, and Danny for your presentation. I can echo some of the things that Danny just presented on. We've been using vans for the same purposes as well. And as far as the impact it has, I mean, countless stories of students that it's just been the difference between them succeeding and not. So it really has a huge impact. And, as far as funding goes, if you get out in your community and tell people about what you're doing, I promise you, you won't even need to ask for the donation. It will come. We do anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000 every year in donations, and I don't ask for any of it. People want to give to these students. You just have to invest the time to get out there and start building those partnerships, but even more importantly, just spreading the awareness. Great job, Danny, and I can echo that what they're doing works because we've seen it here as well. Now, one of the things that we've been doing here in Polk is an audit, and the purpose of this audit is specifically as it relates to school of origin transportation. We want to know how we're doing. We want to be able to build partnership and collaboration with our transportation department and have data to kind of bring to them just to kind of look at how we're doing and how quickly kids are getting their routes. As we all know, the longer it takes, potentially the longer children are sitting out of school, especially if they don't have an alternative way in the meantime, which going back to vans, that's where vans do come in handy. So one of the things we've been doing for many years is we look at all of the routes, all of the students and all of the routes that get requested. And I personally do an audit of them. I go through one by one. If you have a large district with a lot of students that get school of origin transportation, it can be a timely process, but it's the investment, investing your time doing this is worth it. And I've seen, the result of that investment. So I do think it's beneficial and worth the investment. But you essentially, what you're doing is you're looking for that data. You're wanting to see how long it takes your district to turn around and provide these routes from the date that you request it. So I go through one by one and I look at that and I try to come up at the end of the day. What I'm looking for is an average number of days it takes for our district support services to provide school of origin routes from the date it's requested. And of course, we don't count weekends or school holidays. It would be business days. And if you do this long enough, you then have previous year's data to compare it to, and you can kind of get understand your trends. And, so if just say, for example, we recently got a new director of support services. So, that year after, if all of a sudden we saw, an increase of the number of days, we could say, okay, well, we could chalk it up to having someone new over there. And, that gives us more reason to schedule a meeting with them. And that's exactly what we do. So after we complete this audit and we get the data needed to understand how long our families are waiting, we then schedule a meeting with our support service team and we bring that information to them. And we talk about it and figure out, first, if there's things that they're doing well, we want to kind of start with that and let them know, hey, you're doing really great in these areas and we appreciate it. And even maybe tell them some of the stories of students that are, succeeding because of the work they're doing. You really want to get them to buy into what you're doing. And that face-to-face contact helps. At the same time, you do want there to be some accountability. You want to let them know why it is important for these students to get these routes as soon as possible, and tell them the stories of what can happen if they don't. And so we've been blessed to have a great partner in our support services, and it's not to say it's perfect. That doesn't exist, but I do believe that having data to bring to them, to show them, just how long, it's normally a surprise. I will say this, it's normally a surprise. I think a lot of times, our partners maybe think that they're doing it quicker than they are. And so they're kind of shocked to hear, oh, wow, I didn't realize it was taking 5 days or 7 days or whatever, whatever it is. So, it's really has been beneficial. And also, when you're scheduling those meetings with them, you're building that partnership and that collaboration. And, through that, we have found that many of our area managers experienced homelessness when they were, children. So there's that kind of personal connection for them, with this. And so when they're building the routes, oftentimes they said that they're kind of thinking of themselves when they were a kid. So you don't know any of that though unless you meet with them. So I guess kind of what I'm presenting on is, it's an audit, but it's also just encouragement to have that face-to-face contact with your partners, whether that be your partners in the community or your partners in other departments within your school district. So I think that's that's all I have. But if anybody has any questions about that, you can. I think Karen and Anna Sophia are going to be sharing the spreadsheet that we use. That's very straightforward and is my information as well. So I'm more than happy to help anyone who needs help.
Thank you both so much. That's such great information. I want to just address one question that came in the chat, and Danny and Ben, please feel free to weigh in on this as well. But one of the questions that just came in was about logistics for a larger school district, that sometimes setting up vans and routes and things is a little bit easier in a smaller LEA. But for larger LEAs, that can be a challenge. One thing that I wanted to share that is we are in the process at Schoolhouse Connection of putting together some Title I Part A homeless set-aside resources for you. And one of the examples that we learned of in that process is the idea of paying for a transportation coordinator with Title I Part A set-aside funds. And so if you're finding in your LEA, in your larger LEA, that transportation is one of the biggest challenges, absolutely use something like the transportation audit form that Ben has shared. And I did drop that link into the chat as well, to look at that data. And maybe that's a great way to advocate for having someone in that role of a transportation coordinator who can help coordinate some of those routes, who can help get some of those transportation, the tricky pieces set up, whether it's cabs or rideshare services or things like that. And so wanted to offer that as an idea, but Danny and Ben, if you have any ideas as well that you want to add, we'd love to hear from you.
I have just so our district is about 11,000 students, so that is probably comparably small to a number of people on this webinar. I would suggest going to either, if it's a district-owned transportation company or you are contracting, and talking to them about having minivans and providing service that way. A lot of what I found is there's a number of places or transportation companies that have not really considered that minivan because it doesn't hold a lot of students. But when you actually look at it, they're not really transporting a ton of students all at once anyway. So talking to your transportation source for the district as a whole and asking if they'd be willing to add these, and here is, what the district will add in value or cost to for them to support that transportation.
I will just add that, we're, I think we're 27 or 28 largest school district in our nation, and there is no one size fits all. So, do our vans work for everyone? No, they don't. But there is a segment of the population as it relates to, kids needing this school of origin and supplemental transportation that it does work for. And so it's been a really valuable resource to have for those students that it does work for. But I will admit, there are challenges, especially when you are part of a very large district geographically, as well as the number of folks that live there. So it's for us, it hasn't been one size fits all, but it has been a definitely an important tool to have in our toolbox.
I I think we've addressed a lot of the questions that have come in. I know, Danny and Ben, there were a couple of questions that came in for you both, but I think that we addressed those. I wanted to offer one more suggestion just because this came to my mind when we were talking about large LEAs, but this is something that we have heard from both large LEAs as well as really rural LEAs, and that is the idea of providing car repairs for families as a way to navigate some of those challenges. There was a question that came in the Q&A panel about a family who lives in an area where it's hard to get to and their car has broken down. And so when we talked about ARP-HCY funds and allowable uses with those ARP-HCY funds, we talked a lot about car repairs. That is still allowable with Title I Part A set aside funds. And so if there are ways that you can think about, does providing one car part help then that family to have access to transport either within your larger LEA or within a more rural area, that might be a great way to meet that transportation need. There are archived webinars on our website about all about car repairs. And I know that there are programs, LEAs that have worked with their CTE programs, their career and technical education, had to remember the acronym, but that worked with their CTE programs that had like auto shop or mechanic programs to help with some of those car repairs. Other LEAs were able to build those through community partnerships to help with some of those car repairs. So just wanted to offer that as another option for thinking about some of those different situations that may be kind of an extenuating circumstance, or you're looking for another opportunity for that. Thanks, Anna Sophia just dropped that link into the chat for us as well. All right, Anna Sophia, I will turn it over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to go ahead and just pull up the slides again. Thank you all for all of your questions. I know there was some that we didn't get to. There were some that kind of we answered at various points, but we are working on trying to get something out at the end of this webinar series where we cover some common themes. So if you didn't get your question answered, don't worry. We're going to provide a follow-up resource at the conclusion of this webinar series. So thank you for your patience there. I wanted to share specifically just Ben and Danny's contact information. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise on this matter. I know everyone is just saying thank you so much, and there's hearts and all the things flying as you all were talking. So thank you so much for your expertise, and just wanted to share that contact information. And then just wanted to share a couple of additional resources. So just a reminder to everybody that we do have a new liaison resource hub where you can find information about meeting all McKinney-Vento responsibilities, including more information about providing transportation. So this is a really great place to start if you're newer or just need a refresher. So I encourage you to check that page out. This is our contact information. We are on all the socials, LinkedIn, we are on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and X, formerly Twitter. And of course, you have our link to our SHC Slack. Again, a great place to talk to each other about what you're doing in transportation and make sure to continue that conversation past today. This is Karen and I. We are available to you whenever you have any questions around transportation or the McKinney-Vento Act more broadly. We also have a contact form on our website, and we encourage you to use that just to ask us any questions that may come up after today. I mentioned this at the top, but I will reiterate the best way to keep in touch with us is just to sign up for our newsletter to get all the updates. So go ahead and scan this QR code and sign up if you have not already. And with that, again, just want to say a huge, huge thank you to our panelists today, Ben and Danny. Thank you. Karen, thank you for your lovely presentation around transportation requirements. Not an easy job. And thank you all today for your participation. And we hope to see you on a webinar soon. Thank you all.